There's an article on Johnny Ive going around that, while I think it absolutely captures the frustration of a segment of people, also feels like it represents an extreme perspective, reaction, and yes, even agenda from those people. Now, that's not unusual when big changes happen. Some people are happy with them, some people not. But it's also not all there is to the story. In fact, it can be only a very small part of the story, to the point where other people directly involved, sources even more familiar with the matters, if you will, would call some of those stories objectively false. And if it's all wrapped up in a deeply cynical narrative about Apple's current position in the market, with no context or clarity as to why or compared to who, when misses like HomePod are emphasized and huge hits like Apple Watch, which is currently bigger than iPod at its height, are dismissed, and most especially when people whose jobs depend on them being skeptical promote the story not with questions or attempts at confirmation, but with abject glee over all the tea being spilled, regardless of whether or not a cup was even knocked over, well, then I don't even know what's happening anymore. But I do know what to do about it. Find someone super smart and super talented who was actually there, who worked on prototyping and design at Apple, going back to the days of Steve Jobs and the original iPhone, and who understands how and why the design culture at Apple works the way it does. Then, set up an interview, even if that person is away on her vacation in France, so she can share her experience and insight. Now, Skype did not cooperate with us at all, so apologies in advance for the bad video. But what she has to say is so terrific, I simply have to share it with you, no matter what. So thank you for your understanding. Now, without any further ado, she's Miley Ko, I'm Rene Ritchie, and this is Vector. Miley, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
So your background, just for anybody who doesn't know already, is in design and prototyping.
In design prototyping, and most recently, it's also in design leadership.
So I loved what you were writing on Twitter, because the news last week broke about Johnny Ive leaving Apple. And instead of piling on with a hot take, you decided to share some of your experience on actually working with people in industrial design. And it was fascinating to me.
I mean, I feel like having been in this industry for 20 years, I was at Apple for 7.5. It just feels like so many people don't understand the nature of what makes Apple so great, and what is it that allowed Apple design to succeed. It's also like a kind of, it's like a plunge into cold water for a lot of Apple designers when they leave Apple and realize that nothing else works that way. And it's always been a big mystery to me, because so many people say, oh, we really value design and we really care a lot about design. And yet, when you look at a lot of the rest of the industry, it's a dramatically different environment around the design team.
It's not the same
that's
culture.
That's the part. I think it's not the same culture. Yeah, exactly. And I think people don't talk about that. Either that or they don't know. The crux of it is that the operations at Apple to support design, the operations, the engineering, everything else around it allows the design to blossom and allows it to happen. And it isn't just like, oh, somebody goes off into a room, like Johnny and Steve went off into a room and Johnny made some miraculous sketches, and then, you know, unicorns and sparkles appear, and then this design, and then like question mark, profit, right? Like, you know, there's like machines literally being invented and molecules literally being rearranged in order to support amazing design. Like, it's not just like the design work happens and then we're like, we can all go to the beach.
Well, I think to your point, people don't realize that you can say you want a chamfered edge, but you have to figure out the machine that's going to actually chamfer that edge for you. Then you have to source all those machines. You have to get them into production, and you have to run at sufficient yields that you can actually sell those things for a non-obscene price.
And you've got to make sure that the machining that happens and the material that you get is actually the material that you said that you were getting, that it withstands a bunch of pressure. You need to machine the machines that pressure test, and all of that stuff needs to happen within a certain kind of timeline, and, you know, across oceans. Yeah. So the operations aspect of Apple, like I remember when Tim was, named the successor after Steve, and people were like, COO, really? And I was like, yes, because if there's one thing this company cannot screw up right now, it's its operations.
Yeah.
They make hardware, and making hardware is hard. I mean, like, how many Kickstarters have we seen Just, you know, bomb because people don't realize how hard it is to actually like manufacture and fulfill a whole bunch of
How
physical
many
goods.
products don't ship or how many products ship that don't work?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that, and then also just the whole way that the org supports design. You know, I was looking around a little bit. You know, one thing that's dramatically different is the role of PM with respect to design. That works completely different at Apple as it does from the rest of Silicon Valley, and that is
So PM,
definitely
I always got a sense like when you talk about, if you talk about, at least on the software side, I'm not as familiar with the hardware side, but they have engineering product managers and then they have the actual like coding project managers, like and they all work together, but the EPM is doing like the scheduling, is almost like the dispatch, making sure every train arrives at every station on time, where the actual coding manager is making sure that all those bits get written.
It's exactly right. The EPMs are making sure that all the trains are running, getting to stations on time, lining up when they need to line up, that it
Yeah.
all makes sense together. And I think a lot of the rest of a lot of other organizations suffer because they don't have that. I think a lot of other organizations also suffer because they've got too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Because there's feature level product ownership alongside design and engineering. And that's something that never happened at Apple while I was there. There were product owners, which were largely like the SVPs, who had to ensure that decisions were made and roles were clear and everything made sense together at a high level. But there weren't a whole bunch of feature level product owners telling designers what to do or even really collaborating with designers.
Yeah.
A lot, I remember there was this kind of vibe of, I got to talk to a designer, which there doesn't seem to be in other places.
Yeah, well, it was a very design-driven culture. Like, again, from the software side, there was always DRIs, directly responsible individuals. I'm guessing because Steve needed to know who to yell at. That was their primary function. But on the hardware side, it seems like it was a very small, very collaborative group.
On the design side, yeah, definitely. Very small, very exclusive, super collaborative. And they did collaborate with groups outside of ID as well. Collaborate with HI as well.
Yeah.
You know, this was talking about sort of the old world. There's a whole new world now. Obviously, which I'm sure that all of your listeners have read up copious amounts about, probably.
But that's the thing, is that most of the stuff that's being put out now is either from people who weren't involved at Apple and sort of just wanted to get a hot take out, or in any organization, like in any family, there are going to be people who are happier with change, less happy with change, like things the way they were, like things the way they're going to be. And immediately after anything happens, you always get the disgruntled take, which may represent one person or three people, but probably doesn't represent 20 people.
No, it's true. I think there's that. And then also, I think a lot of people fundamentally, I mean, I think it's hard if you haven't worked in design and you haven't worked in design at multiple organizations. It's kind of tough to understand the nature of it.
Yeah. If people aren't familiar, Evans Hankey, is that how you pronounce her name? Mm-hmm. Yeah. She is now taking over industrial design and reporting in to Jeff Williams, the COO. Like what I've heard is that she's basically a force of nature, and you seem to sort of confirm that to me.
She's amazing. When I was working there, it was very clear that she made shit go. Like, Evans, I have this way of putting things about operations at Apple. Like, if you were to listen to the rhythm of work at Apple, if you were to make it audible and speed it up, you could hear music, because there's a rhythm to it. There's a rhythm and a predictability. There's like a sort of a start, middle, and end to the seasons. And there's a clip that everything runs on and makes sense together, partially because there's such strong project management. And mind you, the project managers are very clear that they're not calling the design shots.
Yeah.
I'm talking about project management in general. And that's part of, like, I feel like what it was like to work with Evans was that you knew certain things had to happen by a certain time. You knew what kinds of things had to happen by a certain time. Not necessarily defined creatively, but she was there as like this motor, making the things go and making sure that everything that needed to happen was happening. And that was a long time ago already now.
Great artist ship is like the oft-cited quote, but that ship part is just what she handled.
Absolutely. And it's been that way for a long time. And she was definitely I think under-celebrated because there was kind of a stereotype of what people in the ID team looked like and sounded
Yeah.
like. And so it was really easy to pass over her. But even when I was there, everybody knew like Evans is making stuff happen. There were some people in the organization who'd complain and be like, ah, she's such a hard ass. And I still remember this amazing, the sound engineer and I were talking one time and he said to me, you know, I bet nobody would be complaining she was a hard ass if she was a guy.
Yep.
Because she just was a great leader. And she didn't
well,
necessarily lead in this way that was super visible, where like she did some sort of song and dance in front of everybody. No, it was just like she made sure shit happened.
and the thing that was also wild to me is that we keep seeing these articles basically bemoaning the lack of design at Apple. And I know like it is fine to criticize any individual product. Like I think just for example, I think this smart battery case is super efficient, but it's got that big hole dump on it and everything, all design is compromised. But people saying that Apple's like lost its design culture. When you look back at the iPad Pro and the Mac Pro and the Pro display and the iPhone 10 and Apple Watch 4, and this is just in the last 2 years, I find those kind of takes really hard to just mentally digest.
Oh, it's about the organization support around the design team
Yeah.
much more than it is about whether or not there's creativity or great designers inside the organization. Apple does not make rash decisions is the other thing I think people don't realize, right? So this like announcement came out now, but when things like this happen, an organization like Apple who makes hardware, which is like hardware is hard, and so they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They've been transitioning to this configuration for like a long ass time. That's the other thing.
And it's unforgiving. Like you can ship a software patch. It's real hard to ship a hardware patch.
Yeah, people need to understand a lot of things to wind up in that position at Apple, especially because of the nature of hardware. So that type of decision doesn't just happen overnight. And it's likely that a lot of the changes that you see now or changes that you've already seen have been aspects of them, like figuring out how this new world is going to work for a very long time. Actually,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's already been confirmed publicly.
Yes.
Yes. So,
I want to say obvious, but nothing, everything is always obvious in hindsight. So, but it was obvious that Johnny was off doing Apple Park and working on Apple Retail. And he said as much, and he showed up at the Union Square Apple store opening. Like he was deeply involved in that, but Apple still needed to ship iPhones. Apple still needed to ship Apple Watches. They still needed to ship AirPods. All those things. The amount of new Macs they've shipped over the last 2 years is staggering. It seems incredibly well. Like it seems like they're executing really, really well now, and that doesn't just happen. That has to, like you said, be carefully managed.
yeah.
And it's also there's been a bunch of different reactions that at least I've heard, and some of it is just Johnny's going on to his own company, but he trained all of us. We spent a decade or more working with him, and we want to make him proud. And it's not, it's like, oh, I'm just going to start adding knobs. We're going to start adding knobs to everything now that he's leaving. It's sort of like the making Apple design was one of his greatest product achievements. Not just the products they design, but the team that goes about designing it. And that, I mean, sure, some people are going to go into rebellious youth stage and say, I always wanted to do this, the way that we got iOS 7 after iOS 6. But there's also, all of that is informed by everything that they've done with Johnny for the last decade.
No, that's absolutely true. I think I felt the same way when Steve passed, is that there's this ethos that's instilled in you after working there, and you almost can't get anybody's voice out of your head after you've worked with leaders like that. That voice stays inside your head and carries you forward. I think that a lot of the stuff that's also really hard to relate to people is exactly what you were saying, which is designing the organization. The organization has been deliberately designed around design. That's the whole point. The product is, it's the organization. At some point in time, when you're that high in creative leadership, you're designing the organization and you're designing the team so that it can execute. You're no longer directly designing, the products. And so I think that the image I imagine in a lot of people's head is like Johnny design output, when it's really been like combination of Johnny and other leaders designing the organization and their own exit from it. that's what you're supposed to do as a leader.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the old, get run over by a bus thing. If you part of your job is making sure someone's there if it ever happens.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the ethos is so deep, but more than anything, I think the thing about Apple that's underappreciated are those operations to support design. The engineering, both on the product design, as in the hardware product design side and the software side, everything is always in service of this like broader vision, which is properly kept, ideally by the curators at the top, which is what a lot of the time the leadership serves. And you've got great people cranking out the ideas at the bottom. So what needs to get preserved is that curation and the operations to support it. And of course, the amazing engineering chops that are throughout the organization and the scientists and everybody else. But those things don't go away overnight. Those things aren't attached to one name, you know?
Well, even like there was that old saying that Steve and Johnny came up with the iPad, but it took Tim to figure out how to sell it for $500, at quantity. And I think, to your point, I don't think people appreciate that not big O operations like actually doing logistics and fulfillment, but small O operations permeates every organization at Apple, much as design does, and much as just the pure culture of the company. Like the software engineers have to finish that code by the time that iOS launches, and the hardware engineers. Everybody has to get their job done, and that's through the EPM program. That's hugely operational.
Like the EPM role, it exists in certain other hardware organizations, but the difference in role between EPM and PM and that sort of thing is like totally different in other organizations. And it's funny because I'll speak to other design leaders about design organizations in different companies. And sometimes I'll talk about the way that design was set up at Apple, and everybody just kind of shakes their head and they're like, it's not like that anywhere else,
Yeah.
And I'm like, but why?
If
it worked so well, why is nobody putting more work into replicating it? I don't know.
What was funny to me is there was this big article yesterday that everyone was talking about where it said that, a bunch of designers were rudderless at Apple because Johnny wasn't there to approve or disapprove designs. And everyone I spoke to was like, never happened. We've been raised to do this. We know exactly what to do with our designs. When he's there, it's amazing, but I can make absolutely any decision I have to make as a design lead at Apple. And I think that's, of course, that's the entire reason that they were trained in the entire job that they have.
Yeah. And that 1,000 no's for every yes thing is very real. I think that's the other thing, is nobody's afraid to say, like, it's not good enough yet.
Yeah.
Because you hear more of that, like 99% of the time. Which is interesting because in a lot of other organizations, you hear the opposite. It's good enough already.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, I feel strange saying this to you because you worked in prototyping, but in order to get to 1,000 no's for every yes, you have to have 999 other things that they've said no to. Like there's a tremendous amount of work involved in getting to the one yes.
It's absolutely right. And it's so strange to me in some other places, like, I've come across other attitudes in the design world where people are like, oh, I don't want to do any work that gets thrown out. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That's like 99% of what I spend my time doing while I was at Apple. And then you get the 1% that goes through. And it's amazing.
It's hard to get to the result without going through the journey, I think, is the thing. Like if you just sit there, plop it down, like there's no, I don't want to get, like the Buddhists would say suffering, like enlightenment through suffering, but that's the version of this, I think, that happens, is a constant iteration leads to the inevitable result.
Yeah. It also makes people really fast and really creative because you have to go through so many iterations. You're just going to come up with lots of things. And then the other thing is that the development process is non-linear. I think in a lot of places, people set a target and they're like, okay, we're going to build this thing, and here's what we need to do to get to the MVP. I was talking to a veteran Apple designer the other day who left Apple and was like, what is this MVP business? I just heard about MVP, and I heard it doesn't mean most valuable player. It means minimal viable product.
Yep.
Like, why would I do that?
Whereas Apple's really good at getting to minimal delightful product.
Right. Yeah. Deciding that minimum is not going to be below a certain bar. But yeah, the development process is non-linear. There may be things that just, it's not the right time. It's not the right place. We can't do it for under $500. We already have the technology. So many times when people write something, they're like, hey, I have an idea of what you should do, Apple. Like, I remember being on the inside being like, yeah, yeah.
Anything is easy that you're not in. I had a friend who went to work at Apple, and I'm exaggerating for effect, but basically said, I've been reading the internet. I know what you're doing wrong. And they said, okay, what are you going to do? And he gave them like a list of 3 things. And they took out a virtual box and said, here's the first time we did it. And these are the repercussions. The second time we thought of it. And here's the repercussions. And the third time, these are all the reasons we didn't do it. But if you could think of it, bright internet guy, you go ahead. If you can fix all these problems.
Yeah, I felt like another emotion I often had when we were inside was this feeling that other people were shipping stuff that we would have cut.
Yeah.
This sort of like gratuitous, like flashy, as Johnny would put it, I think it's, we could say something like, I feel like it's wagging its tail in my face type of stuff. Like other people would ship that.
I probably shouldn't say this, but I saw at an event one time, I was standing there and there was another Apple executive with me and we were chatting briefly and Johnny walked up and they said something about the product and Johnny's answer was like, I think what people don't realize is the Apple executives in real life talk the way they do on stage. Like they're very, very direct, very plain spoken. And Johnny just looked at him and goes, maybe, I don't know. We have what we think it is, but once it gets into customers' hands, that's the only time we'll actually see what it really is, when we'll actually learn what they need from it. And it was like, that could have been with a white background in a video, but it was really what he thought about the product. Like he could do all the work that he could do, but until it got into customers' hands, he really didn't understand the product.
Yeah, I certainly never expected people to do all the things that they've done with the products that we've shipped. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think the other thing, well, with him specifically, or with anybody really that works in anything that's manufactured and they're in a position of leadership, is that, so first of all, when you're in a position of leadership, people will interpret your microfacial muscles to try and get any data possible out of what they should be doing. Right? And then second, if you're doing that and you have a manufacturing chain behind you, then you can't just do stuff or like have random reactions or like speak random words because people will interpret them. And then you might wind up wasting, I don't know how much money on a manufacturing line. So he's also very good with that stuff. And that was something that you could see like start to permeate the rest of the team, that kind of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, I think that's very core to your point, is that this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have to have every stage along the process. Otherwise, you don't get what you design.
Yeah, that's right. I think the other thing is that people don't always know is that those designs, like sometimes they were from years earlier and they had to be cryogenically frozen / put aside for some kind of other reason, and then they'll come back. And then sometimes things happen and they're shot straight into production. And that kind of like track of when something gets created and when it gets released, or when it gets invented and when it gets released, is not linear and it's not predictable. A lot of things depend on an organization's life cycle, on a manufacturing chain's life cycle, what else is going on in the world. There can be like not being able to get the price point to a certain point. There can be so many different reasons. And everything is contextual. Everything is like depends on the life cycle of an organization. So, you know, the decision to have people who are really strong operators take over certain positions is because the operations are what can't fail. Because the operations are like, you know, if we get things into people's hands and they're not working or they're not arriving on time, or like, you know, the shipping and the fulfillment or any of that stuff falls up, you know, that makes people wonder like, well, what else is going to be broken in the organization, right? So that's the stuff that can't go, as it's always been coming up from the team. And, you know, it's never been Johnny off in a room drawing by himself.
And he'd be the first to tell you that.
Right. Or never in recent history. Maybe, you know, maybe it was like years and years ago, but as long as I was there, it was not, that was not happening anywhere in software or hardware. You know, there was always a lot of generation happening. And even some of like the most successful things that Apple has shipped were ideas from like intern projects. But, you know, the routes for ideas to get up to leadership and then, you know, be decided on, and then that direction to be set was what was really strong.
I had another friend who was going to work at Apple, and he got offered a lot more money by Facebook and Google and startups. Well, at startups, he had the option of getting IPO money, like getting in early and getting a lot of money. But he went to Apple because he had an idea that he thought would revolutionize education. And he knew that it wasn't just ideas pushed down from the C-level or the senior vice president level, but that any engineer could contribute an idea, and that idea could be taken and shipped to hundreds of millions of people. And it's like he thought there was no other place where he as an individual could have had that big an impact on, in his voice, like the world, than the way that Apple handles product development.
That's so true. I think it's like that the openness and the willingness to hear the good idea come from anywhere is so important. I think that's another thing that's missing from a lot of other organizations. They also just, the position of responsibility to make those kinds of product decisions and make sure that those ideas are getting gathered and disseminated and curated, like that doesn't, it doesn't happen quite the same way.
I think that's also top down, because there are those famous stories where, Steve did not want to ship iTunes on Windows, but Eddie and Phil said, we've got to do it. And he said, fine, if it goes bad, it's your fault. But he trusted them enough to do it. And he didn't want to ship an iPad mini. And Eddie went and got, another, and said, we have to do this. He's like, fine, but if it goes wrong, it's your, but still he trusted, it wasn't just his opinion. He was smart enough to have an opinion, but to trust the intelligence and the commitment and the passion and the insight of the people that he'd hired to make decisions that maybe would be better than his. And I think that permeated the culture as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility on the SVPs to be great curators and make everything really clear when it comes to those decisions.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're taking time away from your sabbatical to do this all the way from France. I really appreciate it. Yeah,
and no worries at all. I was amused because when I wrote those tweets, they came from this place of like, I admit I got a little bit on my soapbox because it's always been this thing where I'm like, everybody keeps on talking about the design at Apple, but they don't realize that there's all these operations to support it, and that's where the magic is.
We were talking before the show that, one of my favorite sayings from a friend of mine is that people love to mistake cynicism for intelligence. And I think a lot of times the negativity gets rewarded and amplified, and the more reasonable takes sort of get drowned. And I appreciate you taking the time to sort of share things from actual experience and actual insight. And I think it just makes us all richer.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really good to see you.
Thanks so much, Mei Li. You can find her on Twitter @Mei and on the web @MeiLiCo. And if you want to get into the business yourself but don't know where to start, check out Brilliant. Every day, Brilliant publishes daily challenges that provide a quick and fascinating view into math, logic, science, engineering, computer science, everything you need. Just in the past month, tens of thousands of people have used probability to decide when to stop gambling, determined whether they'd weigh more in Helsinki versus Mexico City, calculated the chance for rain by watching the clouds. In other words, a lot of key ideas of computer science with no coding required. If you like the concept and want to learn more, there's a full interactive course related to each daily challenge. You can go in depth to solve fun logic puzzles and challenges, experiment, and learn. To support Vector and get unlimited access to Brilliant's courses and daily challenges, head over to brilliant.org/vector to get 20% off their annual premium subscription. Thanks, Brilliant, and thanks to all of you for supporting the show. Now hit like if you do, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and then hit that bell gizmo so you don't miss the next show. Then hit up the comments below and let me know what you think about Apple's design and where it's going next.